For nearly 40 years, Uganda has been ruled by one man, Yoweri Museveni, a man who came to power as a liberator, but now stands as one of Africa's longest-serving presidents. Yet deep inside the corridors of State House, another story has been unfolding, quietly, strategically, and patiently. A story whispered in army barracks, hinted in tweets, and protected by silence. They call it the Muhoozi Project. Is it a plan for stability or a move to crown Uganda's next ruler by bloodline? Why are generals reshuffled, alliances shifting, and power seemingly preparing to pass from father to son? This is Uganda's silent succession war, where loyalty collides with ambition and a nation's future hangs in the balance. Greater than if you care about truth, power, and the destiny of Uganda, hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and stay with us to the end. Greater than because what you're about to see changes everything.
Inside the Muhoozi Project, Uganda's silent succession war. Chapter 1. The sun bled orange over Kampala, casting the city in a long, weary shadow that stretched all the way to the manicured lawns of State House. Inside, President Yoweri Museveni stood at the bulletproof window of his office, a silhouette against the dying light. 38 years. The number echoed in the quiet room, a heavy stone dropped into the deep well of his memory. He could still smell the damp earth of the Luwero Triangle, feel the weight of the AK-47 in his younger hands, and hear the ghostly whispers of comrades who had fallen along the Bush War's bloody trail. That war had been about principle, about liberating a nation from the tyranny of misrule. It was a fire he had lit, a fire that had forged a new Uganda from the ashes of the old. Aides moved with practiced quiet, placing reports on his vast, polished desk. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones of macroeconomic indicators, stable, growth, controlled inflation, burgeoning infrastructure. They painted a picture of a nation at peace with itself, a testament to his enduring vision. He acknowledged their words with a slow, deliberate nod, the aging lion accepting tribute. His gaze swept over the charts and graphs, the tangible proof of his life's work. Yet, the stability they celebrated felt in that moment like a fragile veneer. The revolution he had led was meant to be an idea, an institution greater than any one man. But institutions, he knew, were brittle things. His eyes, still sharp and penetrating despite the years, drifted from the economic forecasts to a single, silver-framed photograph on his desk. It was not a portrait of the nation's founding fathers or a map of its territories. It was a picture of his son, Muhoozi, clad in the crisp, decorated uniform of a general. The boy's face, so like his own in its younger days, was set in a look of determined confidence. Here was the living, breathing contradiction to his own revolutionary creed. The struggle had been against the very concept of inherited power, against the monarchies and dictatorships that treated nations as personal fiefdoms. A deep, unspoken tension coiled in the room, a silent war between the legacy of the guerrilla and the lure of the dynasty. The long shadow he cast was no longer just that of the revolutionary president. It was becoming the shadow of a father, stretching forward in time, aiming to fall upon a chosen son. The report spoke of a nation's present, but the photograph whispered of its future. And in that quiet whisper, Museveni heard the first, faint tremors of a coming storm. The revolution was contemplating its own end, not in failure, but in the creation of something it was once sworn to destroy. Chapter 2. The general's son, the scent of cordite and red earth was the perfume of his childhood. Before he could properly read, Muhoozi Kainerugaba knew the weight of a pistol in his small hands, the metallic click of a magazine being seated, the stern instructions from his father not as playful lessons, but as foundational truths. His earliest playgrounds were army barracks, his toys decommissioned rifle parts, and his bedtime stories were not fairy tales, but whispered accounts of guerrilla tactics and heroic stands in the misty highland. He learned to walk on parade grounds, his tiny footsteps echoing the synchronized stomp of soldiers, the rhythm of military discipline becoming the rhythm of his own heart. The legacy was not an abstract concept passed down through history books. It was the very air he breathed, a heavy, expectant mantle woven into his being long before he was old enough to understand its cost. Now, decades later, that legacy was a physical force on the training grounds of Singo. Lieutenant General Muhoozi moved through the morning heat, a solid, imposing figure amidst the dust and sweat of a live-fire exercise. His commands, crisp and assured, cut through the percussive thunder of artillery. He did not merely observe, he demonstrated, dropping into a firing position beside a young recruit, his own shot hitting the target center with unnerving precision. A flicker of shared respect passed between the general and the common soldier, a momentary erasure of rank forged in the common language of combat proficiency. The men watched him, their expressions a complex tapestry of admiration, awe, and a simmering, unvoiced envy. They saw a commander who was competent, even gifted, but they also saw the invisible ladder of bloodline that had propelled him to such heights at a speed they could never match. Later, in the cool, shaded quiet of State House, another kind of campaign was being waged. Janet Museveni, the First Lady, moved with a different kind of strategy. Over tea with influential party wives and in carefully curated conversations with religious leaders, her words were soft, her tone maternal, yet her intent was as sharp as a bayonet. She spoke of continuity, of stability, of the unique understanding a son would have of his father's vision. She framed the potential succession not as a power grab, but as a natural, familial passing of the torch, an assurance that the sacrifices of the past would be guarded by the most loyal of hands. Her advocacy was a subtle, persistent current flowing through the corridors of power, reinforcing the walls of the dynasty she and her husband were building. One whispered endorsement, one appeal to family loyalty at a time. She was the keeper of the flame, and she was ensuring it would burn in a vessel of her own blood. Asterisk Chapter 3. Whispers in the barracks. The humid night air in the Kampala barracks clung to the skin like a second uniform, thick with the smell of dust, diesel, and the sweet, malty scent of warm beer. Inside a dimly lit canteen, the day's rigid discipline had softened into the loose-limbed familiarity of men bound by shared hardship. Glasses clinked. Low murmur of conversation ebbed and flowed, and in the corners, shadows danced with the secrets they held. The subject, as it so often did these days, had turned to the rapid, seemingly unstoppable ascent of Lieutenant General Muhoozi Kainerugaba. It was a topic spoken of in halves and hints, a dangerous current running beneath the surface of casual soldierly banter. Sergeant Akat, a man whose face was a roadmap of scars earned over 2 decades of service, stared into the amber depths of his bottle. The lines around his eyes deepened as he listened to the younger soldiers speak of the general's latest promotion with a tone of inevitability. He took a long, slow drink, the liquid doing little to wash away the bitter taste in his mouth. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the canteen's din, yet it commanded the table's attention. He spoke not of tactics or training, but of history. He recalled the old songs of the Bush War, the promises etched in the blood of fallen comrades, promises of a republic, a nation where a man's worth was measured by his merit, not his name. He feared, he confessed, that those songs were being forgotten, replaced by the silent, creeping rhythm of a dynasty. His words were not a shout of rebellion, but a lament for a revolution he felt was being quietly entombed in the very house it had built. Across the table, Lieutenant Ajuru, young, crisp, and fiercely ambitious, straightened his back. He saw in Muhoozi not a hereditary heir, but a modernizer, a leader who understood the new frontiers of warfare and national pride. He defended the general's promotions with a litany of accomplishments, the successful operations, the loyalty he inspired in his units, the sharp, strategic mind he had displayed at Singo. To Ajuru, the skepticism of older soldiers like Akat was the rust of outdated thinking, a failure to recognize that the nation needed a strong, continuous hand to guide it through turbulent times. He argued that stability itself was a form of merit, and that Muhoozi represented the surest guarantee of that stability. His defense was passionate, logical, and utterly blind to the profound constitutional and philosophical chasm that Akat's fears represented. The divide at the table was a perfect, painful microcosm of the silent conflict gripping Uganda. It was a schism between the old guard who had fought for an idea and the new generation being groomed for a reality. It was a tension between the hard-won principles of a republic and the seductive, simple logic of blood. As the night wore on and the bottles emptied, the conversation faded, but the unease did not. It lingered in the silence between men, in the averted glances and the thoughtful stares into the middle distance. The whispers in the barracks were more than just gossip. They were the fault lines of a nation, and every soft-spoken word, every cautious fear, and every fervent defense was another subtle tremor, signaling the slow, inexorable pressure building deep beneath the surface. Chapter 4. A Father's. The private study was a sanctuary of worn leather and polished mahogany, a world away from the echoing halls of State House. Here, the scent was not of bureaucracy, but of old books and the faint, earthy aroma of cattle that seemed to cling to President Museveni's favorite jacket. He stood before a large map of Uganda, not the political one marked with districts and constituencies, but a simpler, more personal chart of his ranch in Ruakachura. His finger, calloused and sure, traced the winding paths between the grazing lands. Muhoozi stood beside him, the general's uniform feeling strangely formal in this room of childhood memories. The father was not lecturing the son on geopolitics or economic theory. He was teaching him how to tend a herd. He spoke of the ankle cattle, their long, majestic horns curving toward the sky. A good herdsman, he explained, did not control the herd with force. He understood its rhythms, knew which bull led with strength and which cow followed with caution. He positioned himself not as a predator, but as a part of the landscape, guiding the collective movement with subtle pressures, with an intimate knowledge of the land and the weather. A leader who chased the cattle only scattered them. A leader who understood the pasture could lead them to water and rich grass without a single shout. It was a metaphor woven from the red soil of his youth, a lesson in statecraft disguised as animal husbandry. Power, he implied, was not a club to be wielded, but a current to be channeled. Muhoozi listened, his gaze fixed on the map, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw not peaceful pastures, but the complex, fractious landscape of a nation. He saw the envious glances in the barracks, the calculating silence of the old ministers, the hungry expectations of the youth. The simple, pastoral wisdom felt like a relic from another age, ill-suited for the digital battlegrounds and political minefields of the modern era. A quiet doubt, heavy and cold, settled in his chest. He was a soldier, trained for clear objectives and defined enemies. The subtle, patient art of herding a nation felt like a language he had not quite mastered. The weight of the legacy his father described felt less like a mantle and more like a chain. Seeing the uncertainty in his son's posture, a rare crack appeared in Museveni's formidable composure. The revolutionary's gaze softened into something simpler, more human, a father's gaze filled with a vulnerability he showed to no one else. The man who had stared down armies and shaped a nation's destiny for 4 decades now looked upon his son with a flicker of something akin to fear. He placed a hand on Muhoozi's shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle. The future, he insisted, was not a question of readiness, but of duty. The revolution needed a custodian, not just a president. It needed a keeper of the flame, someone who carried the fire in their blood, who would ensure that the long struggle, the sacrifices of the bush, would not be undone by the whims of politicians or the passage of time. His voice, usually an instrument of command, was low, almost pleading. This was not about power for its own sake. It was about ensuring that the story of Uganda remained the one he had written, with his own son as the next chapter. In that moment, the statecraft ended, and the raw, unvarnished truth of a father's ambition for his legacy was laid bare. Asterisk Chapter 5, the first tweet. It began not with a speech or a decree, but with a single, cryptic line of text that bloomed on a screen in the dead of night. From the verified account of Lieutenant General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, a message pulsed out into the digital ether, a pebble dropped into the still waters of the nation's consciousness. The old lions must rest. The time for new lions to rise has come. The words were simple, almost poetic, but they landed in the hushed corridors of power with the force of a detonation. In the plush, air-conditioned homes of Kampala's elite, ministers and business magnates sat bolt upright in their beds, their phones illuminating faces suddenly pale with a cold, sharp panic. The message required no official translation. Its meaning was felt in the gut, a primal understanding that the carefully maintained equilibrium of the past decades had just been irrevocably shattered. The long-dreaded signal had been given, not from a presidential podium, but from the palm of the general's hand. By dawn, the digital tremor had become a seismic shockwave. In his fortified office at the Chieftaincy of Military Intelligence, General Kainerugaba stared at a bank of monitors, his expression a granite mask of concentration. His analysts, young men and women with tired eyes, scrolled through a torrent of data, thousands of retweets, proliferating hashtags, and a wildfire of comments spreading across Facebook and WhatsApp groups. They mapped the reaction in real time, their screens a spiderweb of glowing connections, illustrating how the single tweet was being dissected, celebrated, and feared from the bustling markets of Kaisni to the quiet university libraries of Makara. Kainerugara's task was to measure the public pulse, to separate the orchestrated cheers of the general's digital brigades from the genuine, spontaneous reactions of a populace that now saw the succession plan laid bare, not in a secret party memo, but in a viral post for all the world to see. The intelligence was no longer gathered from whispered informants in dark corners. It was now harvested from the blazing, unforgiving public square of the internet. Meanwhile, in a sparsely furnished safe house across the city, a different kind of analysis was underway. Opposition figures, their faces grim in the light of a single bear bulb, huddled around a laptop displaying the same tweet. To them, this was not a vague philosophical musing, it was a declaration of war, encoded in the language of social media. They saw the old lions as a direct reference to the party's founding generation, the men and women who still clung to the Republican ideals of 1986. The new lions were Muhoozi and his generation of loyalists, the beneficiaries of the very dynastic system the revolution had once sworn to overthrow. They decoded the message as the first open move in a soft coup, a signal to his followers that the time for patience was over and the time for mobilization had begun. The battleground for Uganda's soul had shifted. It was no longer confined to the closed-door meetings of State House or the grumbling canteens of the barracks. It was here, in the limitless, chaotic, and deeply manipulable realm of cyberspace, where a nation's future could be set in motion with just 280 characters. Chapter 6, Old Guard Unease *, the scent of slow-roasted goat and matoke steamed up the windows of the secluded Manianio mansion, blurring the view of the guarded, manicured gardens outside. Inside, the air was thick with more than just the aroma of a lavish meal. It was heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and the cloying perfume of political ambition gone sour. Senior Minister Amama Mbabazi, a man whose face was a granite mask of calculated calm, moved among his carefully curated guests. These were not the young, brash faces that now crowded Muhoozi's orbit, but men and women whose own histories were woven into the very fabric of the nation. Their hands were marked by the ink of countless documents, their minds housed the institutional memory of the Republic, and their eyes, tonight, were shadowed with a shared, profound disquiet. They were the architects of the modern state, and they had gathered in secret to confront the specter of its unmaking. The dinner was a masterpiece of discreet opulence, but the conversation that flowed with the South African wine was bitter. Mbabazi, seated at the head of the long mahogany table, did not begin with a toast. He began with a memory, his voice low and steady, recalling the precise, legalistic language of the 1995 Constitution, a document they had all helped to birth. He spoke of its checks and balances, its clear lines of succession, its foundational principle that Uganda was a republic, not a kingdom. Then his gaze swept over the assembled faces, former ministers, retired generals, senior party stalwarts, and he pointed not with a finger but with a chilling silence to the elephant in the room, the general's son. Muhoozi's cryptic tweet was not an isolated folly, he argued. It was the logical endpoint of a years-long campaign, a deliberate unraveling of their life's work. It was the sound of a dynasty being hammered together over the grave of their Republican ideals. A palpable generational clash hung in the air, as tangible as the steam rising from the serving platters. These elders saw Muhoozi's rise not as progress, but as a regression, a betrayal of the bitter Bush War that had been fought precisely to prevent power from becoming a family heirloom. They saw his social media bravado not as charisma, but as a dangerous, undisciplined volatility. They saw his military promotions not as merit, but as the systematic placement of a crown prince's guard. Their plotting, therefore, was not for personal gain, but for a principle. Leaning in, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers, they began to map a counter-strategy. It was a plan to reinforce the dying embers of Republican values. They spoke of discreetly rallying the original members of the national resistance movement's historical leadership, of leaking carefully worded memos to the press that questioned the constitutionality of a hereditary succession, of using their remaining influence to block key appointments and protect institutional integrity from the family's encroaching shadow. It was a rearguard action, fought not with bullets but with bylaws, a desperate attempt by the old guard to remind the nation and the president himself of the revolution's original foundational promise. Chapter 7, The Midnight Meeting. The safe house was a ghost in the Kampala night, a nondescript bungalow tucked away on a quiet, tree-lined street in Kololo, its windows blacked out and its silence a stark contrast to the city's distant, nocturnal hum. One by one, they arrived, not in the official convoys that marked their public lives, but in unmarked sedans with tinted windows, their headlights extinguished as they turned into the secluded driveway. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of stale coffee and new paint, a sterile environment chosen for its utter lack of history or personality. This was a place for the future to be drafted, away from the prying eyes of the old guard and the restless whispers of the barracks. The men and women who gathered in the sparse living room, its furniture pushed against the walls to make space for a large, central table, were the architects of that future. They were Muhoozi's inner circle, a blend of crisp military uniforms and sharp, expensive suits, the twin pillars of martial power and financial influence upon which a new order could be built. At the head of the table, a large digital map of Uganda glowed on a tablet, its screen reflecting in the determined eyes of the attendees. A senior Special Forces commander, his chest a constellation of service medals, pointed to key barracks and divisions across the country. His voice was a low, tactical monotone as he outlined a proposed reshuffle, a careful chess game of postings and promotions designed to place loyal, ambitious officers in command of strategic unit. The plan was not for a coup, but for a consolidation, a quiet weaving of Muhoozi's influence so deep into the military's fabric that any resistance would be isolated and impotent. Beside him, a telecom magnate, whose empire had been built on state-granted licenses, nodded in agreement, his fingers steepled. He understood that in the modern era, control of the army was only half the battle. The other half was waged in the palm of every citizen's hand. It was the businessman who then unveiled the second front of their strategy, a comprehensive social media campaign. He slid a sleek laptop to the center of the table, its screen displaying a series of sleek, professionally designed graphics and video storyboards. The plan was to launch a coordinated digital blitzkrieg, a multi-platform onslaught that would rebrand Muhoozi from a military scion into a populist hero for the youth. They would flood Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok with curated content, gripping clips of his training exercises, heartfelt messages about national pride, and slick animations promising a digital Uganda, a land of innovation and opportunity. A team of influencers and a network of automated bot accounts were already on standby, ready to amplify the message, to swarm critics, and to manufacture a tidal wave of online support that would create an illusion of inevitable grassroots momentum. The goal was to make #Muhoozi Project not just a hashtag, but a national mood. As the night deepened, the discussion grew more granular. Lists were drawn up on legal pads, names of key figures in the civil service, the judiciary, and parastatal organizations. Each name was debated, their loyalty assessed, their potential for resistance noted. For every skeptic, a plan was formulated, a promotion to a harmless sinecure, an early retirement package, or, in the most stubborn cases, the threat of a financial or legal audit. This was the quiet, bureaucratic machinery of ascent, the meticulous placement of friendly faces in every lever of power. The coffee pot was drained and refilled, the ashtrays filled with the butts of expensive cigars. There were no raised voices, only the quiet, relentless hum of plotting. By the time the first hint of dawn tinged the blacked-out windows with a faint gray light, comprehensive blueprint for Muhoozi's ascent had been drafted. It was a strategy that married the brute force of military positioning with the subtle, pervasive power of the digital age, a plan to not just win power, but to engineer the public's consent for it. As the conspirators slipped away one by one, returning to their public lives, they left behind a room empty, but for the lingering charge of ambition, the ghost of a dynasty waiting in the wings for its cue to take the stage. Chapter 8, Public Face. The roar was a physical force, a tidal wave of youthful energy that crashed against the venerable walls of Macra University's main hall. Thousands of faces, lit by the glow of phone screens and the harsh glare of television lights, were turned upwards, a sea of adoration fixed upon the single figure standing at the polished lectern. Lieutenant General Muhoozi Kainerugaba, out of his military fatigues and clad in a sharp, modern suit, seemed to absorb the energy of the crowd, his posture radiating a confident, almost casual authority. He did not speak of military strategy or his father's legacy. His words were a siren song for the future, a glittering promise woven from the language of Silicon Valley and the aspirations of a generation staring at a horizon of limited opportunities. He painted vivid pictures of a digital Uganda, a nation of tech hubs and innovation centers, where a young coder in a Kampala garage could build an app that would change the world. He spoke of billions of shillings in youth venture capital funds, of partnerships with global tech giants, of a country leaping over the dusty, potholed present into a sleek, high-speed future. The air crackled with the electricity of his vision, and with every promise, the cheers grew louder, a cathartic release of pent-up hope. For the students crammed into the hall, he was not a general's son. He was a prophet of progress, a lion of a new digital pride. But high in the balcony, seated in a reserved section of worn velvet chairs, a different kind of audience watched in silence. The senior professors of political science and history, men and women whose lives had been spent deconstructing the anatomy of power, observed the spectacle with a clinical, weary detachment. They saw past the charismatic sheen and the populist promises. They heard the subtle, masterful manipulation in the narrative. One elderly professor, his fingers steepled under his chin, noted how Muhoozi's speech meticulously avoided any mention of the constitutional framework, of the established political processes, or of the very real, systemic obstacles to his grand vision. It was a narrative of bypass, a story that positioned him as the sole conduit through which this bright future could flow, a future that required the suspension of the old rules and the unquestioning acceptance of his leadership. They saw the careful construction of a cult of personality, the strategic use of hope as a weapon to disarm criticism. To them, the cheering was not the sound of enlightenment, but the echo of a carefully engineered consensus, a triumph of style over substance, of charisma over constitutionalism. The thematic tension hung thick in the air, a dissonant chord beneath the roaring symphony of approval. On the floor, the students saw only the charisma, the bold promises that spoke directly to their frustrations and dreams. They saw a leader who looked like them, who spoke their language, who offered an escape from the stagnant politics of their fathers. In the balcony, the professors saw only the manipulation, the calculated erosion of institutional guardrails, the familiar, dangerous pattern of a power grab gilded in the language of progress. It was a perfect schism, the raw, emotional appeal of a new beginning versus the cold, rational fear of an old ending. As Muhoozi concluded his speech with a raised fist, bathing in the adulation, the two Ugandas in that hall remained separated by a chasm of perception. One saw a savior, the other a threat, and the roaring applause could not mask the silent, profound disagreement over what and who was truly being cheered. Asterisk Chapter 9. Behind closed doors, the heavy, soundproof door of the presidential study clicked shut, sealing the two men in a silence that felt louder than the roar of any crowd. The scent of old leather and polished wood, usually a comfort to President Museveni, now seemed to absorb the tension thickening the air. He stood behind his vast desk, its surface clear but for a single typed document, the proposed list for a sweeping military reshuffle. His son Muhoozi stood before him, not as a subordinate general, but as a claimant, his posture rigid with an impatience that seemed to vibrate through the room. The carefully constructed public harmony had been left outside. Here, behind closed doors, the raw machinery of succession was grinding, its gears of ambition and experience clashing with a jarring metallic friction. Muhoozi's argument was a swift, decisive thrust, a military maneuver aimed at securing the high ground. He gestured to the list, his finger jabbing at names of loyal, younger officers from his inner circle. He spoke of the need for fresh blood, for commanders whose allegiance was not divided by the old politics, men who understood the new threats and the new opportunities. He framed the reshuffle as a necessary modernization, a clearing of the dead wood to make the army leaner, more responsive, and utterly committed to the nation's future, a future he implicitly would lead. His words were confident, almost urgent, painting any delay as a dangerous vulnerability, a window for the old guard to regroup and fortify their positions against the inevitable. It was the logic of a man who saw the finish line and could not understand why his father was still cautioning him about the proper running form. Museveni listened, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes, those famously penetrating eyes, missed nothing. He saw not a strategic plan, but a naked power grab, rushed and transparent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, a deliberate counterpoint to his son's fervor. He did not dismiss the need for change, but he framed it within the vast, complex tapestry of the nation he had woven over 40 years. He spoke of balance, of the subtle ecosystem of tribal allegiances, regional interests, and personal loyalties that held the army and the country together. A sudden, wholesale purge, he cautioned, would not be seen as modernization, but as a panic-driven consolidation of clan power. It would create martyrs of the sidelined officers and fuel the very resistance Muhoozi sought to crush. He warned against the haste of the lion cub, so eager for the hunt that it scares the entire herd into a stampede, leaving nothing but dust and desolation in its wake. His was the weary voice of experience, a man who had spent a lifetime herding the unruly cattle of a nation and knew that a sudden, loud movement could undo decades of patient work. The conflict laid bare the fundamental schism between them. Muhoozi's ambition was a straight line, a clear trajectory from point A to point B, paved with the loyalty of his men and the force of his will. His father's experience saw a winding, treacherous path full of switchbacks and hidden ravines, where every move had to be calculated not for immediate gain, but for long-term stability. The son saw the throne and could think only of claiming it. The father saw the intricate architecture of the palace and feared that a single, clumsy pillar removed could bring the entire structure down upon their heads. The argument circled the room, a tense, silent dance of two opposing philosophies of power. No resolution was reached. The document remained on the desk, a stark symbol of the chasm between the impatient ambition of the heir and the cautious, calculating experience of the king who was not yet ready to fully relinquish his crown. The door remained closed, but the conflict within had just been uncorked, and its potent, divisive energy now seeped into the very foundations of the state. Asterisk Chapter 10. The purge begins. The official communique arrived not with a bang, but with the sterile click of a send button, a PDF file dispatched from the Ministry of Defense that landed in inboxes just as the morning sun began to gild the acacia trees. It was a single, cold paragraph, its language dry and bureaucratic, announcing the retirement of General David Sejusa from the Uganda People's Defense Forces, effective immediately. There was no fanfare, no ceremony, no grateful citation for decades of service. The document was a political guillotine, its blade falling with silent administrative finality. In his spacious home in Mbuya, the general stood by his window, still in his crisp uniform, and read the words on his phone. The screen's glow illuminated a face that had remained impassive through battlefield horrors and political intrigues, but now, for a fleeting moment, it crumpled. It was not the loss of rank or title that carved the lines of despair into his features. It was the brutal, unequivocal message. He was a skeptic, a man who had occasionally voiced concerns about the Muhoozi Project in the wrong company, and this was the price. He was the first domino, pushed publicly to see how many others would fall. The news spread through his household like a poison gas, invisible and suffocating. His wife, who had stood by him through postings and coups, let out a small, wounded cry, her hand flying to her mouth as if to physically trap the sound of their ruined future. She saw not just a retirement, but the erasure of their social standing, the end of invitations to state functions, the cold shoulders that would soon turn their way. Their eldest son, a law student at Makerere, slammed his textbook shut, the sharp crack echoing the fracture in his family's world. He saw his own ambitions, a career in public service, a chance to follow in his father's footsteps, turning to dust, blacklisted by association. The comfortable, privileged life they had known, built on a foundation of military service and political connection, evaporated in the time it took to read a single paragraph, leaving behind the stark, exposed reality of disfavor. The house, once filled with the quiet hum of influence, was now a tomb for a career. The air thick with the despair of a family witnessing the vindictive reach of the dynasty they had doubted. Across the city, in the plush, glass-walled offices of the MK movement and the bustling mess halls of the Special Forces Command headquarters, the reaction was a mirror image of the Sejusa family's grief. It was a celebration, but a quiet, cunning one, held behind smiles and knowing glances. Young officers who owed their rapid promotions to Muhoozi's patronage exchanged brisk, satisfied handshakes. This was the signal they had been waiting for, the first open move that proved their patron had both the will and the power to clear the board of obstacles. In a private club in Kololo, a group of businessmen allied with the general's inner circle raised glasses of single malt whiskey, their toasts unspoken but understood. The removal of Sejusa was not just about one man. It was a demonstration, a shot across the bow of every other senior officer, minister, and party elder who harbored reservations. It was a message, brutal in its clarity: fall in line or be retired. The purge had begun not with the thunder of tanks, but with the whisper of a memo, and in that whisper, the succession war declared its first, unambiguous victory, setting a chilling precedent for all who dared to stand in its path. Asterisk Chapter 11, Rising Star. The state media machine whirred to life with a synchronized hum of adulation, its gears polished and its message gleaming. Lieutenant General Muhoozi Kainerugaba's promotion was not merely a military appointment. It was a national event, a coronation in all but name. Television screens across Uganda glowed with montages of the general in action, dropping from helicopters into training exercises, striding purposefully past saluting soldiers, his face a mask of stern resolve under a beret laden with gold braid. The voiceovers, rich with sonorous authority, narrated a carefully curated history of his career, a litany of successful commands and visionary leadership, each achievement polished to a brilliant sheen and presented as irrefutable proof of his destiny. Newspapers ran full-color spreads, their headlines shouting of a new lion for a new Uganda, framing his ascent not as a political maneuver, but as the natural, glorious unfolding of the nation's progress. The airwaves were saturated with this single, triumphant narrative, a wall of sound and image designed to drown out any dissenting whisper, to make his rise feel as inevitable as the sunrise over Lake Victoria. Yet, even as the official celebration echoed through the land, a different kind of document began its silent, insidious journey through the underbelly of power. It was an anonymous letter, a collection of stark, typewritten paragraphs on plain, unwatermarked paper. It had no official letterhead, no signature, only the cold, hard weight of its accusations. It did not question Muhoozi's lineage or his father's legacy. It attacked the very foundation of his glorified image, his professional competence. The letter circulated like a ghost in the corridors of Parliament, slipped under office doors, left on benches in the members' lounge, passed from one uneasy hand to another. It cited specific alleged failures in past military operations, botched logistics, tactical misjudgments, unnecessary casualties, details that were too precise, too insider to be easily dismissed as fiction. It spoke of promotions bought with loyalty, not earned with merit, of a command style that valued sycophancy over strategic genius. It was a poison-tipped dart aimed at the Achilles heel of the state media's heroic narrative. The effect on the members of Parliament was a study in silent, simmering tension. In the plush lounges and marble hallways, the public congratulations and backslapping for the general's promotion were performed with strained smiles and overly hearty voices. But behind the closed doors of their offices, MPs from both the ruling party and the opposition huddled over the anonymous letter, their faces grim. For some, it confirmed their deepest suspicions, validating the private fears they had dared not voice. For others, it was a dangerous spark that could ignite a wider conflagration of doubt. They read and reread the damning paragraphs, their eyes darting towards the door, aware that possession of such a document was itself a political act. The letter created a schism in their ranks, not along party lines, but along a deeper fault line of conviction. It forced them to choose, in the privacy of their own conscience, between the glittering, state-sanctioned image of the rising star and the chilling, anonymous portrait of incompetence and entitlement that now haunted the shadows of their chamber. The public celebration was a roaring bonfire, but this letter was the slow, cold seep of gasoline, waiting for a single spark to turn the triumph into an inferno. Chapter 12. Opposition Voices. The crackle of the radio was a familiar sound in the cramped, sweltering apartments and bustling market stalls of Kampala, a humble medium that still carried the weight of the nation's conscience. On this evening, the voice that emanated from the cheap plastic speakers was not that of a state-sanctioned announcer, but the measured, deliberate tone of Dr. Kizza Besigye. His words, though filtered through static, landed with the force of hammer blows, each one carefully chosen to dismantle the edifice of the succession plan being constructed in the halls of power. He did not shout. His power lay in the cold, relentless logic of his argument, a scalpel dissecting the constitutional corpse of the Republic. He spoke of the supreme law of the land, the document that was supposed to be the bedrock of the nation, and pointed with forensic precision to the articles that explicitly forbade the hereditary transmission of power. He framed the Muhoozi Project not as a political contest, but as a fundamental betrayal, an unconscionable act of larceny committed against the Ugandan people, a theft of their right to choose their own leaders. His voice was a stark, unwavering beacon in the gathering political darkness, a reminder of the principles upon which the state had supposedly been built. As the interview progressed, Besigye's tone shifted from legalistic dissection to a somber warning. He spoke of the shadows lengthening across the country, of the increased surveillance, the intimidation of activists, and the quiet, systematic strangulation of dissent. He was not just describing a political campaign, he was diagnosing a sickness in the body politic, a creeping authoritarianism disguised as a family affair. His words were a call to consciousness, an appeal to the memory of the revolution that had promised something better than this. He stopped short of explicitly calling for protests, but the implication hung heavy in the air, a silent challenge to his listeners. The interview was not merely a critique. It was a rallying cry, a signal to his vast, decentralized network of supporters that the time for passive observation was over, that the defense of the Constitution would require courage in the streets, not just arguments in the studio. The state's response to this broadcast was swift, silent, and pervasive. Even as Besigye's voice still echoed in the homes of his supporters, the invisible architecture of control was being reinforced. In a dimly lit monitoring center, police technicians wearing headphones tracked the signal strength of the radio broadcast and cross-referenced it with cell tower data, mapping the geographical spread of the audience in real time. Unmarked vans with darkened windows took up positions on street corners in known opposition strongholds, their antennas subtly probing the airwaves. Plainclothes officers, their faces blank and their eyes constantly moving, blended into the crowds near Besigye's headquarters, noting the faces of those who came and went, photographing license plates and logging every gathering, no matter how small, into a vast digital database. The surveillance was a net, woven from technology and fear, cast wide to snare any attempt to translate Besigye's words into tangible action. The opposition had a voice, but the state had ears everywhere, and the hands to clamp down the moment that voice threatened to become a movement. The air was thick with the tension of a looming confrontation, a silent war between the power of a spoken truth and the pervasive, watchful eye of the state, determined to ensure it remained only a whisper. Chapter 13. Family Dynamics. The polished surface of the grand piano in the State House music room reflected a distorted, warped image of the confrontation unfolding before it. Natasha Museveni Kainerugaba stood with her arms crossed, a study in contained fury, her gaze fixed on her older brother Muhoozi. The air, usually scented with lemon polish and the faint fragrance of arranged flowers, was now charged with the bitter electricity of a sibling rivalry that had festered for decades, finally boiling over in the one place they were supposed to be safe from the nation's prying eyes. She did not raise her voice. Her words were icicles, sharp and precise, each one aimed at the heart of his burgeoning myth. She spoke of the relentless, suffocating favoritism, the way every door in the country had been silently, effortlessly opened for him since birth, while she and their other siblings had been expected to find their own keys or remain outside. She was not just his sister. She was a living, breathing testament to the other side of the dynasty, the one that did not wear a general's uniform, the one that saw the family legacy not as a crown to be inherited, but as a burden to be shared or a curse to be escaped. Her accusations triggered a visceral flashback, a sudden, vivid plunge into the red dust of their childhood at the Ruakachura Ranch. The memory was not of shared laughter or playful games, but of a single, defining lesson from their father. A young Muhoozi, barely 10, had been given a new, finely crafted riding crop, a symbol of responsibility over a prized bull. Natasha, a year younger and just as keen, had reached for it, her small hand outstretched in equal expectation. Their father's voice, gentle but firm, had filled the space between them. He had placed his hand on Muhoozi's shoulder, steering him toward the massive animal, explaining the duties of leadership, the weight of command. He had then turned to Natasha, his tone shifting to one of affection, and guided her toward the kitchen, where their mother was preparing a meal, speaking of the importance of family harmony and support. It was a seemingly minor moment, a simple division of chores, but the themes it seeded were profound. For Muhoozi, it was a lesson in entitlement and duty, the first subtle weaving of the mantle. For Natasha, it was a lesson in limitation, the first quiet closing of a door. The riding crop was not just a tool. It was a scepter, and her brother had been anointed with it long before anyone had spoken of presidencies or successions. Back in the present, Muhoozi met his sister's gaze, his own expression a complex mix of defensiveness and a genuine, bewildered hurt. He saw her anger not as a principled stand against a political injustice, but as a personal betrayal, a failure to understand the immense, crushing weight of the duty he carried. He had not asked for this path. It had been laid out for him, like a railroad track, and he had simply been taught to drive the engine. The favoritism she decried felt, to him, like the necessary fuel for a journey the entire family was supposed to be on. Her refusal to simply get on board felt like a sabotage of their collective destiny. The confrontation was a perfect, painful microcosm of the national crisis, distilled into the raw, emotional language of family. It was a battle between the chosen heir, who saw his privilege as a necessary burden, and the sidelined sibling who saw it as an unforgivable theft. They stood in the opulent room, two children of the revolution, divided by the very legacy that was meant to unite them, their silent war in the music room echoing the much louder one raging just beyond the palace wall. Chapter 14. The Twitter Storm. In the digital arena, where wars were now waged with pixels and algorithms, a new front erupted with the ferocity of a tropical downburst. The cryptic musings of Lieutenant General Muhoozi Kainerugaba's Twitter account evolved, shedding their earlier poetic ambiguity for the sharp, unforgiving language of political combat. The tweets came in rapid, staccato bursts, a volley of digital fire aimed with chilling precision. One moment, he was lauding a junior officer's dedication, the post accompanied by a carefully staged photo that radiated paternalistic approval. The next, he was eviscerating a veteran journalist who had penned a critical column, his words not a rebuttal but a character assassination, labeling the writer a foreign agent and an enemy of progress. He praised allies with extravagant, kingly favor, their names trending within minutes, their social capital instantly inflated by the royal endorsement. He targeted critics with the cold glee of a hunter sighting prey, each tweet a public flogging designed not just to discredit, but to terrify others into silence. The platform was no longer a mere broadcasting tool. It was his throne room and his battleground, and he ruled it with a combination of charisma and menace that held the entire nation in thrall. From this orchestrated chaos, a single potent hashtag was born, #Muhoozi Project. It began as a whisper from a handful of newly created accounts, but within an hour it had metastasized into a trending tsunami, dominating the Ugandan digital landscape. The amplification was too perfect, too synchronized to be organic. An army of bots, digital ghosts with stolen profile pictures and algorithmically generated names, churned out thousands of identical posts per minute, a relentless, mindless chorus chanting the general's praises. They swarmed the mentions of any dissenting voice, a deluge of insults, emojis, and canned propaganda that drowned out reasoned debate in a flood of noise. They created fake polls showing overwhelming support, shared deep-faked videos of supposed ordinary citizens extolling his virtues, and manufactured the illusion of a nation united in its fervent desire for his ascent. It was a disinformation blizzard, a storm of manufactured consent so dense it became difficult to discern where the genuine support ended and the digital fiction began. Watching this storm unfold from her cramped, book-lined office in downtown Kampala, journalist Sarah Bairit felt a familiar, cold dread coiling in her stomach. Her computer screen was a mosaic of open tabs, Twitter analytics, network mapping software, and encrypted chat windows with her sources. She was not reading the tweets for their content. She was dissecting their DNA. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the digital fingerprints of the campaign. She identified the bot farms, their IP addresses clustering in unassuming office buildings in Kampala's industrial areas, their activity patterns a dead giveaway of automated scripts. She mapped the financial trails, following cryptic payments from shell companies to social media marketing firms with ties to figures in Muhoozi's inner circle. Her investigation was a painstaking archaeology of the artificial, digging through the layers of digital filth to uncover the human hands guiding the storm. She saw past the trending hashtags and the viral posts, recognizing the campaign for what it was: a sophisticated, state-adjacent psychological operation, a deliberate poisoning of the national conversation designed to demoralize opposition, manipulate the youth, and clear a path to power not through the ballot box, but through the overwhelming force of a manufactured online reality. In the eye of the Twitter storm, Sarah Bairit was the quiet, determined counterforce, a solitary figure armed with truth, trying to piece together the architecture of the lie before it became the nation's new, unshakable foundation. Chapter 15, Loyalty Test. The summons arrived not as a request, but as a command, a terse message on encrypted devices that pulled the highest-ranking army commanders from their posts and sent them speeding toward State House under the cover of a humid, overcast afternoon. They were ushered into the long, wood-paneled conference room, a space that had witnessed the plotting of coups and the ending of wars, its walls seeming to absorb the weight of every decision ever made within them. President Yoweri Museveni stood at the head of the polished table, not seated, his presence a physical anchor in the room's tense silence. He did not greet them with the familiar camaraderie of old comrades. His gaze was that of a master cartographer, meticulously surveying a map he feared was being redrawn without his consent. The air was thick with the unsaid, heavy with the knowledge that this was not a briefing but an inquisition, a meticulously staged theater where allegiance would be weighed and measured under the president's unblinking stare. One by one, the commanders were invited to offer their assessment of the nation's security posture. Museveni listened, his expression impassive, but his questions were subtle traps, carefully baited hooks designed to snag on the subject of his son. He spoke of the need for unified command and clear lines of succession within the military structure, his words a velvet glove hiding an iron fist. He watched their eyes, the slight tightening of a jaw, the almost imperceptible hesitation before a reply, the careful, diplomatic phrasing that avoided direct endorsement. He was not listening for their words about insurgent groups or border security. He was listening for the silent music of their loyalty, trying to discern if the tune they played was still the old anthem of the revolution or the new, rising chorus of the Muhoozi Project. When his turn came, General Edward Katumba Wamala, a man whose career was a testament to professional competence rather than political allegiance, found the words sticking in his throat. He spoke of institutional integrity, of the Army's duty to the Constitution above any individual, his voice calm but firm. He did not criticize Muhoozi directly. That would have been professional suicide. But he pointedly avoided the exuberant, personal pledges of fealty that others had offered. He emphasized the importance of meritocratic promotions and the dangers of perceived politicization within the ranks. His hesitation was not born of disloyalty to the nation, but of a deep, abiding loyalty to the principle that the military must remain a neutral shield of the state, not a personal spear for a ruling family. In the silence that followed his measured response, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Museveni's eyes, those famed instruments of perception, narrowed just a fraction. The general's internal conflict, a war between his soldiers' instinct for self-preservation and his officer's oath to a higher ideal, had been laid bare, and in that moment his fate was sealed. The test was over, and he had failed. The transfer order came within 48 hours, a dry, administrative document that felt like a death sentence for a career. General Katumba was reassigned to a ceremonial post at the National Defense College, a gilded cage far from the levers of real military power. The message to every other officer in the room, and by extension to the entire army, was brutally clear. There was no room for hesitation, for professional nuance, for loyalty to any ideal above the rising star of the president's son. As Katumba packed his office, the framed photographs of a lifetime of service seeming to mock him from the walls, he was not filled with rage, but with a profound, weary sorrow. He had not chosen a side in the succession war, but by refusing to swear unquestioning allegiance, he had been cast out. His transfer was not just a personnel change. It was a lesson, a public demonstration that in the new Uganda being forged, the highest virtue was not integrity, but the unequivocal, unblinking loyalty of a subject to his crown prince. Asterisk chapter 16. The Economist's warning asterisk. The digital tremor began not in Kampala, but in the hushed, hallowed halls of a London-based financial journal, its analysis ricocheting across global markets with the cold, impersonal force of a mathematical certainty. The article was not a political polemic. It was far more dangerous. It was a clinical dissection, a series of charts and projections that mapped the Ugandan shilling's future against the looming variable of a political succession. The language was dry, academic, devoid of the fiery rhetoric that characterized the nation's own internal debates, which made its conclusions all the more devastating. It modeled scenarios of capital flight, investor panic, and currency devaluation, painting a grim portrait of an economy built on decades of fragile stability, unraveling in a matter of weeks if power were seen to be transferred not by constitutional process, but by bloodline. The report did not mention Muhoozi or Museveni by name. It didn't need to. The term hereditary succession was enough, a universally understood code for the specific political cancer metastasizing in the heart of Uganda. The warning landed on the desks of international fund managers and local tycoons alike, a silent alarm bell ringing in the sterile world of numbers and projections, where fear was quantified in billions of dollars. In State House, the president's economic advisors assembled in a hastily convened meeting, their faces illuminated by the grim glow of the article displayed on a large screen. They spoke in calm, measured tones, their words carefully chosen to downplay the foreign analysis as speculative, alarmist, and ignorant of the unique resilience of the Ugandan economy. They pointed to the robust foreign reserves, the controlled inflation, the major infrastructure projects nearing completion. One